So, okay, we're recording. Greetings, everyone. I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Culture of Empathy, Building a Culture of Empathy, and I'm here with Jim Doty, who's founding director of the Center for the Study of Compassion, Altruism, Research, and Education, CCARE, which is centered at the Stanford University. And welcome to discussion. We're just going to have a sort of a casual discussion here to discuss the state of empathy and compassion movements in the world, and maybe where we see the empathy and compassion movements going from here. That's kind of what I understood. We're going to kind of an open, free flow discussion. Like, I mean, you're a real leader in the compassion movement with this, like CCARE. You've been doing all kinds of interviews and all kinds of trainings and all kinds of studies on compassion. I've been working for about 14 years on how do we make a more empathic society. So where do we go from here?
Well, as you probably sense, the world doesn't change overnight. And I think that with the immense amount of work you've done, certainly you've turned many people towards this idea of empathy and putting yourself in another person's shoes. And I think once you do that, that really allows you to have a sense of what someone is experiencing. And if that experience is suffering, then it motivates you, hopefully, to alleviate that suffering, and which is the definition of compassion. So I think empathy and compassion oftentimes go hand in hand. And in fact, there are some, like Jamil Zaki, I don't know if you've interviewed him yet, but his perspective is that empathy's compassion. I slightly disagree with him, but the important thing is that we're all sort of working towards the same agenda. If you look at the number of articles published, let's say over the last decade, in some ways a number of articles are exponential over the last decade or so. Similar to probably what happened earlier with the nature of mindfulness. There's immense great interest in this topic because of its power to profoundly affect people's lives. So I think that is even more so the case in the face of the pandemic. And in some ways, also, as we saw at the Capitol steps, this group of people who wanted to tear it down and be destructive, it made us, I think, look at these people and wondering what is the driver of their behaviors, and hopefully through a empathic and compassionate sense. But I would certainly say now more than ever, these concepts and ideas are critically important for our mental health and frankly, for our future.
Well, maybe we could frame it in that we have a new government, now a new president, and Joe Biden, we just, like only a couple of weeks, we're into this new administration. And I thought maybe to sort of frame the discussion, I could just do a quick screen share here of if you could give me disable screen sharing. Is that possible to give me screen sharing?
How about if I make you the host?
And then, cool. Yeah, great.
That
make
way
me the host. That'll make it easy. Hey, you're now the host. I got the power. Okay, so here is sharing the screen. So here it is, Joe Biden. This is a quote from Joe Biden. Empathy matters, compassion matters. We have to reach out to one another and heal this country, and that's what I'll do as president. So I think that says something about the direction that his administration wants to go. And then when he gave his acceptance speech at the Chase Center, on the screen, they had these huge screens in the background. He says that people have chosen empathy. And then he, scrolled through a couple different topics that people have chosen. What was the other one? Unity. They have chosen science, and there was one or two others, and they kept scrolling through this. And then when Kamala Harris came out on the screen, out on the stage, it was projected sort of over her. So they made a big point of, hey, this is important to this new administration. So I think when you're talking about, how do we kind of reach out to the people that were doing the riot at the Capitol? How do we get all the sides together and talk to each other? And in terms of the direction, it does seem that there's an openness with the administration for these values.
Well, I don't think there's any question that there is this openness and a recognition that you have to reach out to the other side. One of the challenges, does the other side want to reach out to you? I think what's most important is that instead of having a toxic narrative, which is us against them, and a toxic narrative of we're going to do everything for our people, and if you're not our people, we're going to create a situation where the other people suffer. I think immediately getting rid of that in and of itself has a lot of power. I think you also have to go back and understand what makes people who suffer do actions which seem so far-fetched to you that you can't even imagine. Because only in an environment of love, acceptance, listening, are people able to change. Now, there's some other issues here. I mean, if you look at the nature of how cults are created, we unfortunately do have that. And we have this QAnon phenomenon and this pushing of false narratives for selfish reasons. And that's very, very powerful. Truth, though, does matter. And I think that if you keep pushing verifiable truth, that will at some point have an effect. As we've seen, though, pushing a complete false narrative and a lie also has, unfortunately, an effect on people. So I think it's really important that Biden continues to push science, continues to push truth, has transparency that lets others see what he's doing. I think those will be very helpful in helping us come together more and hopefully have a kinder and gentler country. But I still think there's a lot of work to be done, and it's not going to happen overnight. And in many ways, the pandemic has made some of those efforts worse. But that being said, the wonderful thing is you went from a government that was completely ineffective and incompetent, and you can tell this by a whole variety of their actions, to one where you have, I hate to say this in some ways, professional bureaucrats who understand how the government works and can now implement many of the things that were impossible for the other administration. Some people have projected this idea that we need an outsider come in who, can stir things up. But the problem is technocrats run governments. And as much as people say, I want less government, or I don't want, to be told what to do. The fact of the matter is, if you got rid of every form of government, you would have chaos, and you would frankly have a very small group of people immediately start taking everything. And you simply need to look at Russia after the breakdown and see who benefited. And it was not the average person, and it certainly would not be the average person here either. It was people who already somehow were connected to the power structure and then took advantage of it. So I think this is also a recognition that, on the one hand, yes, it's great to talk about lack of government and how it gives you freedom and you can do what you want, but it doesn't protect you from tyranny. Plus, the other aspect is that government is here for a reason, and that's government is in some ways here to protect us from ourselves. You can look at it in the context of the Environmental Protection Agency, where prior to that creation, you had all these rivers polluted by industry and corporations. You can look at it in terms of the Department of Education, which has given millions and millions of people opportunities. And essentially almost every department has been an advocate for the citizenry, and not to diminish them. You know, people get caught up in three things. One is
Can I
this
give a
idea.
reflection of what I'm hearing so far? Just
Yes.
so I'm hearing is you're just seeing that there has been a change in the government, and that you've heard people be critical of the government, but you see a role, the importance of it, and you feel that there's what we have now is more like bureaucrats, and that's important to have a functioning government. And heard maybe some concerns about more of an authoritarian kind of Russian type government. And I think you're sort of making the case for having a functional government, if I understand it
No,
correctly.
I think you're exactly right. I think that's important. Whether we necessarily agree with every aspect of it, that's different. But tearing it down doesn't make the problem better either.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about, I'm totally there. I'm not for, let's tear the whole thing down. I did go to different demonstrations previously, and there was anarchists there. And I asked the anarchist, I said, what's the role of empathy in anarchy? And he says, and it was like, well, the police don't empathize with us, so we're not going to empathize with them. So it became sort of, they're not going to empathize with us, so we're not going to empathize with them. We're going to tear the whole thing down. Somehow this more caring, empathic society is going to emerge out of that, which I don't buy either. I think so. The means are the end. It's like if we use violent means to tear things down, that's kind of what we're going to get as a society. So if we have empathy and listening and dialogue as sort of the means, the means are the end. So we have to engage in dialogue and bring the different sides together. And you did reach out, I know, to Glenn Beck. I saw an interview or a dialogue you did with him. So you reached across the aisle. I imagine you're a Democrat or on the progressive side, and you reached out to a Republican, spokesperson, leader of that movement.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Glenn and I developed a friendship, but at some point, because he was very critical of Trump, but at some point he jumped on that bandwagon like so many others have. And I just really had a very difficult time interacting with him. And that's not to say I'm not friendly towards him, but that being said, it went from, okay, let's talk and I'll listen, to, if the Democrats take over, they're going to destroy the government and take our guns and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which, you even look at the start of the Obama administration where that was the statement, he's going to come for our guns. And there was never any statement about anybody coming for anybody's guns per se. Now, there may have been thought on a rational manner in which people get screened who own guns. But I think almost anyone would agree with that. And that's different than taking guns. So I think you really do have to listen and not get locked into some statement that is just like, it's like stop the steal, right? I mean, it's a powerful statement, but it has no relationship to truth. And so I think, the ideal should be you try to look for truth.
So it sounds like you came to sort of an impasse on that somehow. Am I hearing that correctly?
Well, I think that, Glenn's a very smart guy and he's very insightful, but he will also start heading down a path that is irrational at some point, I think. And in fact, in my interactions with him, if you would immediately call him out and then have a discussion, then you can change his perception. Or he can change mine potentially. Of course, I'm not always right. And I can understand where he's coming from. He can understand where I'm coming from, and we can sort of have a slightly different dialogue. But, if you won't listen and you insist on going down a path, it's once you're down that path, it's much more difficult to pull somebody back.
Okay, so I'm kind of hearing at that point, you feel like he wasn't listening and hearing you, and then he kind of goes down a path, and then it kind of, there's a break in the connection, sort of.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, any dialogue you have, there has to be respect, there has to be compromise, there has to be a sense that the other person has value enough for you to continue the discussion.
Well, maybe you could invite in, we could do an empathy circle together, because that's sort of become the center of the work that I've been doing. So the thread that I've followed has been based on the work of Carl Rogers, with his
Sure.
active listening, empathic listening. He did it in a client therapist, sort of
Right.
relationship. He started a little bit into sort of conflict mediation with it. And so I've been focusing on that, getting small groups of mutual empathic listening, turn taking. And so you would speak to Glenn and he would have to reflect back his understanding to your satisfaction of what you have said until you feel heard to your satisfaction. And then you go back and forth, like in small groups. And
Right.
I found that to be the most effective sort of first step practice for people hearing each other. And uh, along that vein, my congressman, Mark DeSaulnier, has agreed to take part in an empathy circle with Republicans. So we're actually looking for some Republicans that would be willing to take part in that process. So I don't know if you'd be interested in something like that to sort of try
Yeah,
that out.
sure. Yeah, anything is possible. I mean, it's even like, it'd be interesting to get into some of these discussions with some people in the Republican side of the Senate or the House, right? To have these types of discussions.
Yeah, that's what he said. He said he would do it with Republican congressional representatives. He's here in Contra Costa. He's a representative here. So if we could
Yeah.
bring them together, that'd be pretty cool. It's the same process. I don't know if you've seen the empathy tent work that we've
Yeah.
been doing. We set up, this was before COVID, we
Sure.
had the political right would come to like Berkeley. They would, we say, we want free speech, we're here to speak. And then there'd be a counter demonstration. There'd be sort of the moderates, we're against hate. And then it'd be Antifa, we're going to have a fight with you, kind of. And we'd set up the empathy tent and go and listen to both sides and then bring them into dialogues. And we did the empathy circuit that with in Los Angeles. It was an impeach Trump rally, back when that was.
Right.
And we did 6 pairs of, one person from each side. And we did mediations with them. And each of those ended in hugs between the participants. And they all agreed to take part in empathy circles, afterwards. And I had just sent you that link to the documentary Trump Phobia, What Both Sides Fear, and that was kind of featured there. So it seems to me that this getting people together is sort of the next stage. Can we, in terms of the movements, because that's kind of what we're looking at. It's like, what is the move? Where to with these movements, right? Where do we go with the compassion movement? Where do we go with the empathy movement? And for me, the empathy movement is really about bringing people together within, an empathic dialogue process.
No, I think that's right. I think obviously that could be very powerful if it's done in the right way. And I think that is the solution. Is almost to overcome these barriers because frankly, pretty much everyone wants the same thing. Now they may use different language or different context, but everybody wants to feel safe. Everybody wants to have opportunity. Everybody wants to see their children do well, and on and on and on. It's the way they perceive that to happen, or their own experience, or their perceived vision of what the other side wants that's counter to what they want. But as you point out, when you have these conversations, pretty much everyone's not too far apart. It's the baggage they carry into the room. It's not that they want different things. And I think it's removing that baggage so they can see that they're much more alike than they are different.
And it's that point of feeling like you're not heard, being heard. Like when you talked about Glenn Beck, it sounds like he stopped hearing you around the gun issue.
Yeah.
And the same thing we did, we set up the empathy tent at the city of Berkeley, the town hall. And there's this group of bikers that comes every year, and they were kind of protesting against Berkeley. And they all get together, they have a bit of a rally there, and then they give the finger to Berkeley together, a group portrait of all giving the finger to Berkeley. So we took the empathy tent, we set it up there, and we started, doing empathic listening. We had a group of conservatives in there that we were, talking to. And then a woman from Berkeley, she came by and says, I'm here in my Berkeley bubble. I never talked to conservatives. And I said, oh, we have some right here. Would you like to join us? And we actually did an empathy circle right there. And the topic was gun control. And this was just after the shooting I think it was in Texas. There was some church shooting. And actually the conservative woman had distant relatives that had been killed there. And they started talking to each other, and there would come a point where one person didn't feel heard, and you can just feel that kind of tension, like, oh, I'm not being heard. And then they're sort of on guard, and you can just feel that energy. But I'd say, no, just reflect back what you're hearing. You'll get your chance to be heard. And that would sort of go past that tension. And they just kept dialoguing. And at the end, they didn't solve the problem, but they had a sense of connection. They gave each other hugs,
Yeah, no, I think that's the only environment where you can make sustainable change, where people can have that type of experience, instead of thinking that the other is the enemy and there's nothing to hear from the other. And I think that can be very, very powerful if you set the stage for that. I have a friend of mine who's a former pastor who's doing something called the 3 practices. His name is Jim Henderson, and they do something similar to this, where they get a group of people together and have this back and forth dialogue. And it's very, very powerful. And it gets back to the reality that we have much more in common than we do that separates us. And it helps in some ways to remove your ego from the situation, because that's always a challenge.
Yeah, I think that I use the word common humanity. If we can see that common humanity, that that's a good start. In the empathy circle, we do say you can say anything you want. If you want to, they say, oh, sometimes like, oh, you got to speak from your heart. No, speak from your head, speak from your heart, speak from your ass, speak from any part of your body that you want to. If you want to speak from your ego, feel free, and you will be heard to your satisfaction. So I think it's important that people feel that they can kind of speak, about whatever is alive to them, and they'll feel heard. And my sense is sometimes people are judgmental, critical, to begin with, but once they feel heard, that kind of like dissipates and they start getting more real.
No, I think that's right. I think a lot of people feel they're always cut off without them being heard, and that creates anger, right? Because in some ways it denies them their dignity. You don't think their opinion's worthy, so you discount it. And I think that's an issue.
Well, where do you see the compassion movement going from your, bird's eye view of, having been, quite intimately involved in this movement? Like, where is that? What's the state of it now? How is it? How do you see it maybe progressing?
Well, I think if you look at, again, as we mentioned, sort of the literature, probably 10, 15 years ago, you didn't really see a whole lot. In fact, a lot of people felt that compassion really, it wasn't a worthy academic pursuit. And probably in some ways like empathy, in that some people feel it's hard to pin down. Now, that being said, of course, we've seen the literature dramatically increase in the last decade or so. And so I think this interest and the recognition of the importance of empathy and compassion is ever increasing. In fact, if you look at around the world now, there are a large number of centers, I think 40 or 50 now, many of which resulted from them interacting with the work that I'm doing, which now focus on compassion, which is wonderful. So I think that the interest, the value of this topic is ever increasing. I think that if we look at essentially all religions, and even the nature of how our society would ideally function, compassion's at the core of all of it. You know, being able to look at another person with empathy, being able to see that they're suffering and responding to that suffering. So I think there are many positive aspects. You know, the nature of television or media is one that promotes the negative, and that seems like we're surrounded by that. But the reason is because these people are very smart in the media. They know that if you present a picture of everything being rosy and great, nobody's going to watch. It's only if there's drama or things that can elicit fear that people pay attention, because they're selling a product. So if you don't have conflict, if you don't have distress, if you don't have anger, if you don't have hostility, nobody is interested. You know, it's like when we were on the savannah in Africa. You know, if you're on a hill and you have plenty of food and you can see everything around you and you have a shelter of some sort nearby, you are just enjoying yourself, versus if you're, you know, in a jungle surrounded by wild beasts, you're always wondering around what's going to happen. And so I think that the nature of media is to create turmoil. And that's just the way it is. And until you can understand that society could not function if 90 to 95% of people were not good and kind and generous. It's a very small group of people that take things to the limit and say or do things that are really horrible.
Well, so what I'm hearing there is you're saying that the compassion movement is growing. There's a lot of centers starting, so a lot of research. It's kind of spreading kind of on its own volition.
Yeah.
And that you're seeing a major problem of the media sort of fostering conflict for drama, and that's sort of a major
I would probably
problem.
say for profit.
For profit, for drama, which leads to their profits. Yeah, for
Yes.
Self-interest, profits. And
Exactly.
well, what can we do about that? I say we go occupy. We'll go occupy. What is it? Fox News and MSNBC, and we'll demand that they have an empathy circle with each other. We set up the empathy tent in front of their offices, and we say, we're not leaving here until Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity have an empathy circle with each other. Now that's taking an action, right? There's you know, getting it out there, because I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take an assertive, you know, activist movement to really get this out in society, because otherwise it's like, oh, you're the kind of a pat on the head, you're the nice compassion and empathy people, you know, you're doing a good job, you know, we're going to go on with regular life, with our regular values, our self-interest and all that, and we'll just give you a pat on the head, and maybe you know, a little, you know, we'll send you a bone to, you know,
Right.
say, oh yeah, we need more empathy in government, but forget, but in reality, you know, we're not going to do anything. So I see that activist, we need sort of an activist role here.
You know, perhaps I'm cynical, but I don't think many of the people on the right have interest in that. I don't mean that in a, well, I guess I do mean in a bad way. Sean Hannity knows when he's telling lies. Tucker Carlson knows when he's telling lies, but they're doing it for one thing. You know, in fact, in some ways, it's like somebody held Dr. Phil to task, right? Because I think he went to, what's her name? Anyway, some actress's bedside after she had a mental breakdown, and sort of made the situation worse. And he said, Well, you have to understand, I shouldn't be held to the standards of a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I'm an entertainer. So what he did was okay because he's an entertainer. And frankly, I think what some of these people do by spreading lies and false narratives is they want to rile the audience to watch them. I mean, Sean Hannity is making $30 to $50 million a year, right? I mean, he doesn't have any interest per se in resolving this issue because he wouldn't be listened to. You know, if you, I mean, if you truly had truth now versus opinion, and I don't even believe he believes his opinions. I think he just says these things, and you know what is more intoxicating also than to be able to call the president of the United States up at any time, to spit out the same narrative that supports him because it gives you access, it gives you interviews. You know, I think that there's a reason for that. So would he be interested? I don't think so. And the same with Tucker Carlson. I mean, you know, it's interesting when some of these organizations were held to task, such as with the Dominion voting situation where they were saying these disparaging comments, you know, suddenly they go, well, we didn't really mean it. It was just an opinion. And I apologize if I upset anybody. So I think a lot of these people know it. Look, I mean, frankly, you would have the entire narrative change if Rupert Murdoch said, hey, stop this. This is lies. You're just, you know, conflating things and making the situation worse.
Well, my family are Trump supporters. So they live in the Central Valley, Sacramento. So I kind of overlap with the different communities, and you know, there's different bubbles, right? And you go into that bubble, it makes total sense when you look to the political left, like the fear and anxiety there, and you go into the left bubble and you look in it. And to the, I mean, the left, I mean, the right would say, well, there's all this self-righteousness, you know, on the left, like, oh, we're right, we care about people, we have compassion for everybody, isn't our righteousness like really great, you know? But they won't listen to the other side, you know? So, and they feel that, it's like, oh, we get the message, we get the condescension, we get the elitism, we get the self-righteousness, and then you just kind of do anything to get attention, right? And we did that. It's like when I first, you know, we set up the empathy tent here in Berkeley, and there was the right wing were set up, the Proud Boys and the 2%ers. And it's like, I'm like going over there and it's like, oh my God, who are these people? And I took over some empathy kisses. We got a little box, there's little kisses in there, and it says empathy kisses, and a card for, you know, I give out this card that says free empathy. So it's that, so I give out that card and I said, come over to the empathy tent for, and so I give it to them, and, you know, they take some kisses and, you know, we talk, and it was actually, we actually became pretty friendly. You know, it was like, you know, once you really hear where they're coming from, they were actually more open to dialogue, I found, than the left in those environments. So yeah, it's a complicated situation. It seems to me the only way to deal with it is to sort of create that container for the dialogue to happen in a constructive way.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think that the left is sort of condescending and righteous, and I think that's really hard, and not being able to see the other's perspective. So I think you're absolutely right. You know, and that's the problem is, you know, the people who get hurt are all in the far extremes, right? But 90% of people are pretty much in the middle. They may be slightly to the right or the left, but it's really the far extremes that you know, take up a lot of the bandwidth.
Yeah. Yeah, and the middle doesn't get the space to really be heard. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's the problem. I mean, even if you look at the election numbers, I mean, while certainly Biden won by popular vote and for the electoral college vote, but the fact of the matter is that these two perspectives were pretty close. You know, out of 80 million, and somebody has what's 72 or 3 million, that's not too far off. That's not like a mandate
Yeah,
at all. And
very
so I
split.
think, I think you have to understand that that's where the world is, and accept that and work with it. But I think most people in the middle are reasonable people who understand there has to be compromise. And in fact, in some ways, this is part of the problem with government lately, is that these people put a stake in the sand and they say, I'm not going to move from there, and no legislation gets done. I think that's in some ways very frustrating for a lot of people. Versus in the old days, I remember, I don't know if you recall Tip O'Neill.
Oh yeah, I remember.
I mean, he was a guy who, I think his roommate was a Republican guy, and they would, I think, play some sort of sport, like, I don't know if it was badminton or handball or something, but the nature of living together, the nature of sharing meals together, the nature of participating in a sport together brings down those barriers where you actually listen to other people. Nowadays, especially I think with the Tea Party movement, it was, I don't give a shit about their opinion, screw them, they're wrong, and I'm not going to pretend to make friends with people. And when you're you're stuck in that path, you can't have these types of dialogues at all. Yet it's, again, when you're forced to be together, you start seeing things happen. There was an example at The Hague, and you had these two different groups imprisoned for war crimes, right? Yet they would get together in this environment, and after a year or two, they're playing chess together, they're eating together, they're cracking jokes together. And that's the nature of it. They really were never that far apart. They participate in atrocities, which is, of course, horrible and wrong. But my point is that they did all of that, but at the end of the day, they found out that they're not really too distant. They all want the same things for themselves and their families.
It's that common humanity you've been talking
Yes.
about. I think it's like, how do we create that? Talking about going forward is, how do we create that environment for the sides to meet? And that's where I think the empathy circle comes in, is if we can get the Republicans, Democrats to have these dialogues and to model it too. If we can show, like, we had one of the leaders from the right wing, when this was after Charlottesville, they came down to the San Francisco to have a rally there. I mean, all hell broke loose in San Francisco. And I reached out to him, a guy named Joey Gibson. He's out of Portland area, doing a lot there with the rallies and stuff. And I invited him to an empathy circle, and he was like, oh, I'll take part. You got to have the invitation. It was harder actually to get the left to take part, but finally they did. And then we had an empathy circle with them online, and they create some little bit of dialogue. It was kind of a starting point. So I think, at least for the empathy movement, that's where I see, is to be more assertive with calling for these dialogues. So like Kinging and nonviolence. For King, it was always like, if there's a problem, you go to the powers that be and say, hey, let's have a dialogue about that to solve it. And the powers that be is like, we got the power. We don't need to talk to you.
Well,
we like the status quo. And then King and nonviolence is about, well, you go study the situation, you develop strategies, sit at the lunch counter, do a freedom ride. But the ultimate goal was to bring those parties into a dialogue. So I see that's kind of where I see the empathy movement is. We have to be assertive and say, hey, it's time for you to talk with each other. And, when the COVID is over, I'd like to take the empathy tent set up there in front of the White House and in front of Congress. And we say, okay, it's time for you now to have empathy circles, across
It would
the
be
aisle.
interesting if you were able to get some people to participate in that. Unfortunately, it's almost as if, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze.
Bless you.
May go on for a while. One of the challenges, and I think if you look at Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, or you look at Israel and the Palestinians, you have generations of people who've been antagonistic towards each other. And, they have family, they have all these events, all this shared history, which of course, gets embedded in this anger and hate. And in some ways, if you look at the people in the House and the Senate, many of them have been there for decades and, fighting each other over and over for years, and being able to get through that anger and hate and hostility is very, very challenging, I think. It's not impossible, certainly.
Well, I think for me, it starts with the empathy circle. And like, as I mentioned, my congressman is willing. I'm meeting last week with his staff, his district director. We're meeting again tomorrow to set this up. So we're looking for the Republicans to take part. And maybe you could email Glenn Beck and say, hey, do you have some contacts? Because Glenn Beck's always saying, oh, dialogue is important. I mean, he's always on his show, always talking about dialogue. So maybe he would have some connections with, if he put in a word, some Republican, Congress members would be willing to take part.
Yeah, I think that might be an interesting thing. In fact, he can get a little surly, but that being said, I think in the right context, like he was going to be more of a gentleman when I was with him and at Stanford, and we actually ended up going out to dinner together. It was very pleasant, actually.
So does that sound like a good kind of a project, like a next project? Let's get some Republicans and Democrat congressional members together and host some empathy circles.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I'm happy to be involved in that.
Okay, cool. We got a project. We got some tangible, what they call it, tangible next steps to do.
Yes. Unfortunately, I have enough projects, but certainly if I can help, I'm happy to help. But
yeah, we just need someone to point. Just you have the contact, like you can be co-host, not co-host, the co-sponsor. We have the Listen First group is co-sponsoring this project. So, just having the name of CCARE would be a great step, and any contacts, that you have would be a good step.
Yeah, he's about the only one that I know in that space.
Okay.
But I can think about it a little bit. I may be selling myself short.
Yeah. So just maybe in closing, like where do you see your work going next with CCARE? What's sort of next on your, path there? I mean, I know you stopped doing you're a neurosurgeon, and I saw that you retired from that, or.
Well, I'm taking a sabbatical.
Sabbatical, okay.
But it could be retiring. I have no clue at this point. I'm just exploring some other things. I think I may have mentioned I'm looking at doing a podcast, and I'm trying to write a second book, and my book may head into a movie here, it looks like, and so I'm involved with that. So, it's all of those things,
Mm-hmm.
So that's keeping me busy. On some level, I miss neurosurgery, but that being said, I have tons of stuff to do.
Mm-hmm. Plenty of projects. Looks like you're looking for the one that really motivates you or really excited about.
Well, it's maybe they all do that. So what are you doing? What's going on with who else is in the empathy movement? You have a cadre of people who are helping you, or
yeah, we're doing trainings now. The trainings have been working really well. So it's really centered around the empathy circle as a foundational practice, and with everybody being online, that's working pretty well. So we set up different cohorts, training cohorts, really refining the trainings and trying to spread them. We offer it for free, and it's sort of a train the trainer as well. So it'll just kind of spread. It's all based on this empathic listening, small groups, learning how to do the active listening, and is a core practice.
So most of the people engaged, though, are they on the left or the right?
I'd say they're mainly mid-left right now. So yeah, we did have we did some mediations between the left and right, and it takes real effort. You know, we reach out, you know, I went to the Republican convention twice, you know, and it was in San Jose once and in Sacramento. And we actually set up a little table there and offered empathic listening to different parties. And, you know, just, you got to reach out, right, to the
Yeah.
different sides. And then we also invited some pro-life, pro-choice, you know, people together, act, you know, and had them do empathy circles. And those are really powerful. I mean, just, you kind of just see what's down deep in the, you know, you know, what the deeper meaning that, you know, these movements have for people. But it takes a lot of work to kind of reach out. And what I'm hoping is, I've kind of switched from sort of the grassroots to getting the congressional representatives to do empathy circles. That if we can have them model dialogue, empathic dialogue, I'm hoping that that'll have sort of a trickle down sort of effect. So that's the other project. That's what I was kind of talking to you about.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I'd be happy to be involved if I can. And yeah, maybe we can do a couple of these where, you know, we bring these, you know, people have different perspectives together to have a conversation, you know.
Yeah, that would
Yeah.
be great. You could maybe as part of your podcast too,
Yeah.
to facilitate empathy circles with different sides.
Actually, yeah, have you seen this new social media thing called Clubhouse?
I haven't, no.
So it's only works with people who have iPhones apparently, but what it is it's a by invitation only social media channel, which I think attracts some people because it makes it seem exclusive. But regardless, what happens is people go on there and they create rooms and they talk about whatever they want. Like I actually did one earlier. It was about my book, but it was about compassion and empathy ultimately. And you know, I think 200 or 300 people showed up, and that might be an interesting place because I don't know the distribution of the people who are on there, but I assume that there's people on the right and the left, and sort of having that you know channel to just have a conversation and a dialogue might be an interesting thing.
Yeah, any sort of a context like that. And, you know, we have the empathy circle, which is just 4 people, 4 or 5 people, and doing the empathic dialogue. Then we have an empathy cafe, and anywhere 30, 40 people come, and we have facilitators, and we do breakout rooms. And then we have the training where people can take a cohort for 5 weeks, and they learn how to facilitate an empathy circle. And so something like what you're talking about would be like how to get the participants into circles. So it's not
Yeah.
like, you know, it's not the sage on a stage, you know, kind of thing, and everybody kind of passively watches. It's really to get the participants engaged in their own learning sort of some tools, and they have these dialogues with each other. So that's kind of I mean, I don't know if if that resonates with sort of a
Yeah.
model.
Well, you know, you can do it multiple ways. Like what I did was ended up talking about compassion and empathy in my book, but you know, you can pick who the moderators, and then you can um, there could be an audience, but you can ask question, or people in the audience can ask a question when you open it up for that, right? Uh, so I think that can be you know very powerful because you know you can start the thing and then go you
Right.
know go beyond
Mm-hmm.
and include other people in the conversation, and they can give their perspectives.
Yeah, there's a fishbowl model too, right? You got like 4 people on the stage, and they're doing an empathy circle, and then others watch so that they learn. Because you
Right.
learn the process by observation, then you can actually apply it to your own life, or you learn the process and then you go into your own breakout rooms to dialogue. So I think that's the thing that we're really focused on is it's heavy participation. You know, it's like you have some sort of a gateway, like you're saying, but really to get people into the circles, into the dialogues themselves, so they have a chance to speak and be heard, And when you do the Q&A, it's always like, oh, maybe I'm going to get my question in. It's all for me at least, it's all anxiety producing. Am I going to say it right? And you don't really get follow-ups and that kind of stuff. So I kind of like the kind of the small group where you really get a lot of chance to connect with others.
But, as I was just saying, having others observe that, and which you mentioned, I think can be very powerful, right? It sort of starts them looking and sort of seeing how other people are, responding to the conversation.
Right. Yeah, that's what the idea with having congressional representatives do. If people see that modeled, then they'll kind of learn it. Like, so if we would have had, instead of having a debate, if Trump and Joe Biden would have had an empathy circle, that would have been a whole different, it would have been a whole different vibe, right? It's like, can you imagine Trump reflecting back, oh, Joe, I'm hearing you say that you really, this is what you believe. Did I hear you correctly? That's kind of
Right.
that would have been that would have been a game changer culturally, I think.
Yeah, no, I think, unfortunately, there are some people who, as much as we talk about empathy, really don't have that capacity. And, I would suggest you, based on the decades and decades long history of Mr. Trump, that is not a value that exists in him. Unfortunately, I have not seen any evidence of that. And I think for good or bad, that's just the way it is. It's like a sociopath. I mean, you can have all these talks and they may at least spit it back out at you. But in terms of feeling deeply about it, I think that would be a very hard thing for him to do, unfortunately.
Well, I think it's only 1 to 3% of the population is sociopath, psychopath. It's a small percentage of the population. And there was studies by Christian Kiesers. Does studies in Holland. And
Uh-huh.
from his study, he said that actually psychopaths have empathy, but it's turned off by default. And they were able to, stimulate, to have them actually shift into an empathic
I would argue with that literature.
Okay.
Now, that may be true of some, but it's like fake it till you make it. Being intelligent enough to sound empathetic, that's what serial killers do, right?
Yeah. So
uh,
yeah,
uh,
I hear you about studies. You never know about studies.
yeah,
There's all
yeah,
kinds of nuances to them. So I've always questioned studies as well. Yeah.
yes. But yeah, I think that, yeah, it's like there are some people that, regardless of all the efforts you make, they're not going to change their minds. And, you either have to identify them early and just move on to other people. But what happens for a lot of people is that once they are forced into understanding societal norms, whether they agree or not, they at least contain themselves, right? It's
Yeah.
like, the people who attacked the Capitol, they were given permission by a authority figure to do that, or at least if almost everyone would say that. And they didn't think they were doing anything wrong, and that somehow that the president would magically pardon it and everything was good. And they thought it was a joke, many of them. So, I mean, I think that if you create a society where that type of behavior is very frowned upon, it starts limiting it. Now, don't get me wrong, you'll still have the far fringe people, like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or some of these other people or the Antifa people who are so far off. But then they're afraid of the consequences, I think, and then they contain their behavior.
Well, I'm offering making empathy and compassion a cultural norm. I think that's what we're both trying to do, isn't it? Where it's like, hey, let's make this so the default cultural value. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, if we can create that, and I think we are creating that slowly but surely, and I think people on both sides of the aisle are interested in this and are acting
Yeah.
accordingly. Again, like I said, most of the things we hear about are the far extremes. Most people in the middle love the idea. I mean, if you look at moderate Christians, as an example, they know that compassion's at the core of their faith, and they look at the other, as somebody maybe that they could learn something from, or vice versa. They follow the positive teachings of Jesus, and so those people you can interact with. It's though when you get to somebody over there who basically says, if you're not a Christian, anti-abortion, like guns, I want to kill you. That's a very different kettle of fish, I think.
I've talked with the Proud Boys when, I told you about giving those chocolates out.
Yeah.
We went to a demonstration in Roseville in Sacramento, and there was three corners. One corner was the right wing. One corner was sort of the Antifa. It was on a street corner there. Was sort of the Antifa group, the more far left. And then the other group was sort of the moderate Christian, left, I would say. And I walked over to the, I had I didn't have my chocolates at that point. I walked over to the corner where the Proud Boys, that group was. It was before they ever got called Proud Boys. And I said, I walked over, and there's this big burly guy there. And he says, "Where's the chocolates?" What? He says, "Where's the chocolates? I was in Berkeley and you were giving out those chocolates." And we were talking with ourselves about, what is that? Is he kind of trying to poison us with X-Lax or something, Right. And he said, well, we figured it was Berkeley. It was probably LSD, so that was okay. So I said, no, I didn't bring any chocolates, but I got a hug for you. And I gave him a big hug. And I said, I'll bring chocolates later. So anyway, what I'm saying is, when you kind of listen to people, offer them empathy kisses, they remember it, and there's actually, it creates a sense of connection. And so there's something about that, that's how we're going to bridge those divides, I think.
But again, I think a lot of people involved in these types of movements are also people looking for connection, right? Whether it's Antifa or the Proud Boys or others, they want something that makes them feel good about being who they are. And, I mean, even if you look at, as an example, people who join gangs, a lot of these people are from broken families or have insecurities, and, and it gives them a place where they're accepted and acknowledged. And unfortunately, and this is also the case with what was it called in Afghanistan, you had all these kids in great poverty, and they would pay them to go to these Islamic schools to, be taught sort of radical ideology. And, these kids are lost, they're hungry, they're poor, and they would go and be radicalized. Yeah. And I think, for a lot of people, being part of one of these groups, Antifa or Proud Boys or whatever, gives them an identity that they didn't have before. I mean, imagine if, you don't have a particularly prestigious job, you are suffering, maybe you don't even have a job, things have been taken away from you, you're divorced, et cetera, all these things build up, and you're just looking for somebody to say, hey, look, dude, I get it, man, come on in and be part of our group. And, and I think it's easy to fall into that sort of pattern, and it's been repeated over and over throughout history, right?
Yeah, so I'm hearing some real understanding on your part on how people get to those extremes. So.
Yeah, well, again, almost every bad thing in the world is a manifestation of your own suffering, right? And when you suffer yourself, it typically results in you self-ruminating and then looking out at the world through a different lens, right? And it's a lens of fear and anxiety. When you engage your sympathetic nervous system, the world shuts down in the sense that it gets very small, and it's this us against them mentality, and you're fearful, and it puts you into this mode where you start sort of not having access to your executive control functions, or those parts of you that allow you to think clearly and discern based on memories or experiences, but just things that will allow you to survive. And so I think that in that mode, on either side, it makes people afraid to move forward. And again, it's like tribalism. People want to hang out with people who look like them, believe like them, because it gives that sense of security. And of course, if you're able to shift, then you can head over to the space of being open, because this is a perspective not of scarcity, of abundance. And when things are readily available, whether it's food, whether it's whatever,
Attention,
job, yeah,
yeah.
then you're
Empathy.
open, you can share, you can talk, you're not afraid of something being taken from you. And it's obviously the place where you function the best in terms of your physiology, but you function the best in terms of how you interact with people.
Are you aware of Daryl Davis? He's
Sure.
yeah.
Ku
So
Klux
I mean,
Klan,
he's
yeah.
sort of a model. Like I think of what you're talking about. It's like here he is, black, a musician. It's like, hey, why is the KKK hate black people? He goes over and he talks to them. He befriends them. And like, a year or two later, they say, look at it. There's actually this guy's pretty nice guy. It's like, what am I doing hating black people? And they give him their KKK robes. And I think
Yeah.
he's got a closet with 20 of those. So I think that really models what you're talking about.
No, I think that's right. I mean, he's a very nice guy, and he's very thoughtful. And yes, and again, almost any sort of radical opinion like that, when you sit with somebody, the person who you think you hate, and again, it gets back to them seeing that you're pretty much just like them, and what are you doing? So no, I think that's very powerful, and I think that's really what we should all strive for. And also, I think the other thing you pointed out is, being self-righteous only separates you from others.
Yeah. Well, okay, then I'm going to send you an email. We'll see if we can get Glenn Beck to get us some Republican congressional representatives to take part in empathy circles. And this has been a great conversation to talk about empathy and compassion. A lot of fun, and
Yeah,
I really appreciate your taking the time for chatting with
no,
me.
I'm happy to do it. Well, you're doing great work, and I have learned a lot. And yeah, if we can get Glenn to do something like that, that would be fantastic.
Okay, well then I'll say goodbye for now, Jim.
Okay,
So,
my friend. Take
bye.
care.
Bye.
Okay. See